First of all, thanks very much, Christine, and thanks to Lizzie for inviting me to do this, which has actually been a really fun project for me. Misa is perpetually interesting, perpetually surprising, and hopefully aspects of this talk will show that. And of course, the installation in the museum is gorgeous, so definitely encourage you to go view that after the talk. Surrounded by aggressive, densely painted canvases and rough-hewn bronzes, Jonathan Meese perches atop the outstretched wings of a hulking sculpture of an eagle, barking to his audience of New York gallery-goers, "The dictatorship of art arrives in New York. Die Diktatur der Kunst ist in New York angekommen." And I should note he goes back and forth between English and German in this performance and in most of his performances. What might come off as a deeply political gesture, the German artist continually invoking the Sieg Heil Nazi salute, repeating manifesto-like commands, and doing so atop the most symbolic emblem of German power, quickly turns to nonsensical comedy and general chaos. Foregoing his megaphone, Misa props a portable boombox on his shoulder and dances unselfconsciously around the gallery while singing the Beatles' pop song Magical Mystery Tour. And as he climbs onto his eagle sculpture, Misa grabs bunches of bananas, positioning them ridiculously on his sculptures and stuffing them inappropriately into his mouth, the eagle's ears, and finally into his pants. Placing German history and mythology on an equal playing field with contemporary pop culture, Misa toys with political and social taboos, making many viewers uncomfortable, not sure when to laugh, when to cringe, or when to give in to what one critic described as, quote, the hypnotic effect of Misa's psychotherapeutic self-humiliation. Since his first major installations in the late 1990s, Misa has consistently toiled in a space between the sublime and the ridiculous, the deadly serious and the unquestionably bizarre. In her review of Jonathan Meese's first exhibition and performance in New York at Leo Koenig in 2001, Roberta Smith described the artist as carrying, quote, the whole history of 20th century German art, not so much in his head as rattling around behind him like a bunch of tin cans. And I should also mention that's actually her reiteration of a famous quote by Robert Motherwell when he was talking about American painting. Indeed, Misa's projects often seem to clash and clang in a cacophony of, among many other things, Dada experiments, expressionist and neo-expressionist painting, Joseph Beuys, and Anselm Kiefer. Misa's work also tackles sensitive subjects in post-war Germany, such as notions of totalitarianism, as well as loaded historical and cultural symbols. What distinguishes Misa's approach is the seemingly manic fearlessness with which he plunges headfirst into repressed or silenced places, his ability to counterbalance the heaviest subjects with the lightest, think Hitler reproduced alongside Scarlett Johansson, for example, and his insistence on always keeping himself, through performance, self-portraits, or incorporation of his name, at the very center. To provide some background and context for Misa's current exhibition here at Mead Art Museum, I will review his career over the last 10 years, focusing on a few early projects in which themes, concerns, and names emerge, all of which carry cultural significance and are also inscribed with personal meaning within Misa's self-created universe. I will explore ideas such as his development of the total environment, his engagement with Germany's political and cultural history, and his incorporation of performance as an integral part of his practice. Throughout these examples, I will address Misa's place within the context of post-war German art, and finally in relation to current trends and expanded practice in contemporary art. So we're going to look at some of the early installations first, as I mentioned. Born in Tokyo in 1970 to a Welsh father and a German mother, Jonathan Meese spent most of his childhood and early adulthood in a pleasant middle-class neighborhood in Hamburg, Germany, where he moved with his mother and two older brothers. A self-proclaimed manic collector, Meese began his obsessive hunting and stashing as a child, and perhaps as an extreme version of a typical adolescence experience, he admits spending most of his teenage years listening to music alone in his heavily decorated room. Meese's first installations, built in his studio in Hamburg, provide an excellent, if not overwhelming, starting place for an understanding of the artist's sources and material, as well as his generally slapdash way of working. This photograph from 1997 depicts the 27-year-old artist in his studio at the Hochschule für Bildende Künste, sporting a hefty wool sweater and British military cocked cap, and posing as a fully integrated part of his environment. And I'll point out now, as you'll see in many further photographs, he's often photographed as part of his installations. It's something that you kind of have to think about. It's not necessarily normal to always photograph an artist's installation with the artist centered in it, but it's a conscious decision. The surrounding walls, floor, and even parts of the ceiling are covered with movie posters, album covers, photographs, and scrawled text. Much of his student work consisted of sculptural assemblages of these items, loosely arranged stacks and piles of books, album covers, and other objects. His professors were driven to despair as Misa appeared at school each week with plastic bags filled with collected items, hoping to discuss them with any and everyone. Through the encouragement of his mentor Franz Erhard Walter, Misa began to explore space on a larger scale, taking over entire areas in whatever room he was allotted. Soon the artist and his professors realized the academic environment was not necessarily best suited for the young provocateur, or perhaps the other way around. At around the same time, Misa began to gain a small following, particularly from his artist contemporaries and a few art dealers. In 1998, after two Hamburg classmates, John Bach and Christian Jankowski, were picked up by Berlin dealer Martin Klosterfelde, another Hamburg alum, artist Daniel Richter, recommended an, quote, even crazier Hamburg artist to the directors of Contemporary Fine Arts Gallery in Berlin. And that same year, before Misa had even had a major exhibition, the artist signed with the gallery, which still represents him today. And now if we turn our attention back to the photograph, we see that most of these various and sundry materials are part of post-war American and British popular culture, which occupies the bulk of the artist's collections and has held a prominent position throughout his projects. This grouping of objects, including albums and posters by the Beatles and Bjork, movie posters for Stanley Kubrick classics A Clockwork Orange in 2001, and multiple headshots of Diana Rigg from the 1960s British television series The Avengers. She's that repeated face that you see in at least those. You see her 3 times here, actually, and she's all throughout the installation and will be in future installations as well. So this selection is indicative of specific early concerns, such as sexuality, masculinity, and social taboo. In addition to the standard images of female and male sex symbols from Marilyn Monroe to Clint Eastwood and Marlon Brando, Misa has included some less traditional figures. 3 of the most prominent text scrawls in the wall, in fact, refer to well-known or notoriously closeted homosexuals. Noel Coward, the mid-20th century British playwright and composer, whose name you see here, Noel Coward is back. Helmut Berger, the Austrian-born actor who starred in Luchino Visconti's films and was also his longtime partner. And Joe D'Alessandro, whose name you see on the far left, film star in the Andy Warhol circle. Less prominently displayed are small images of Charles Manson and Adolf Hitler, the latter of whose image, which Misa will continue to incorporate in his work, represent perhaps the taboo subject in Germany. Finally, the artist has included references to himself. In addition to a small smattering of photographic self-portraits, the phrase Nordsee ist Mordsee, which means North Sea is the Dead Sea, is the title of a 1976 German coming-of-age film about a young boy growing up in Hamburg. And Misa would have been almost the exact same age of the protagonist in the film at the time when it came out. Through these references, and by physically incorporating himself into the installation in the photograph, Misa implicates himself within this coterie. For the 1998 Berlin Biennial, the exhibition that first granted him international recognition, Misa created a similar overall environment. In this installation, we find an overcrowded space plastered with images of pop icons like Clint Eastwood, Diana Rigg, and Joe D'Alessandro, who we had seen in the previous installation, prompting one critic to call the artist, quote, the teenage room decorator. Significant new additions in this installation include political figures Che Guevara and Bill Clinton, along with repeated images of German-born model Claudia Schiffer. While still chaotic and overwhelming, this installation, aptly titled Ahoi de Angst, is organized into smaller chambers that viewers must physically enter and explore, becoming themselves incorporated into the piece. Much of the material that was previously displayed in its original form, whether those are album covers, posters, or other objects like that, are now substituted by reproductions, for the most part, often enlarged and or marked by the artist's writing. So you can see, for example, on the top, on the right-hand side, there's the poster, the black and white poster of Clint Eastwood, where "do" is written atop, kind of on his hat, being the German word for you, so kind of indicating also, if you're the viewer, then you become the you, so also kind of implicating the viewer. Mylar, disco balls, and individual light bulbs create visually disorienting spaces, and the sights and sounds of Gore Vidal's 1979 film Caligula, which was widely banned at the time for graphic sex and incest, give the piece a sonic dimension. One of the spaces was dedicated to the Marquis de Sade, quintessential symbol of the sexual underworld, and another to Dorian Gray, the dandy protagonist of Oscar Wilde's famous novel. Both represent a clear continuation of Misa's fascination with repressed, taboo aspects of sexuality. And, as if to remind us that there is an individual behind the selection of these images and references, Misa includes several self-portraits in various costumes and poses, a prominent signboard reading Ich, I, Ich means I in German, and all this further denotes the artist's physical and metaphorical presence. In this collage, which was actually made from parts of that Ahoi de Angst installation, we see how Misa uses this indicator of Ich, often writing it on images of himself, but also using this mark to associate himself with iconic figures. In this case, Joe D'Alessandro, which you can see on the far right on the top corner. He was the one who was the film star in the Warhol Circle. And also Claudia Schiffer. And the designation of du is also used here again, now implicating his viewer as alternately the Marquis de Sade or Dorian Gray. So we have these two bits of text, du bist Marquis de Sade, du bist Dorian Gray, you are Dorian Gray. More so than in the Hamburg studio installation, Misa here draws from a wider range of sources, including political, historical, and literary figures, irreverently placing them on an equal level with pop icons and even himself. He also directs more attention to this sort of first-hand experience. This type of chambered space, with areas dedicated to different individuals, is reminiscent in concept, if not in outward appearance, to works like Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, an elaborate project the artist began to work on in his home in Hanover, Germany in the early 1920s, and continued in various locations and in various forms until his exile in Norway in 1937. On the left is one view of the Merzbau, which means Merz building, from around 1933, showing an overview of the Merzbau proper. It actually was this sort of labyrinthine structure that expanded throughout several rooms in his house. On the right is the Merzsäule, which means Merz column, so that's the image on the right there, which is from about 1923, and that was an earlier manifestation of the same project. For Schwitters, an artist associated with the Hanover Dada movement, working in the aftermath of World War I, these Merz projects exemplify his manner of negotiating the larger political and social concerns around him through the creation of his own personal universe. The Merz column is a built-up assemblage incorporating constructed forms, organic materials, and fragments of printed materials like flyers and newspapers, all of which carry their own significance, but also relate directly or indirectly to Schwitter's own life. A rampant collector like Misa, Schwitter's projects similarly represented a mode of channeling this energy and these materials into a physical form. The Merzbau includes both universal and personal references. Subtitled The Cathedral of Erotic Misery, this walk-in, rambling environment featured grottos dedicated to themes and figures that interested the artist, from the sex crime cavern to the Goethe grotto, or one dedicated to the painter Vasily Kandinsky. The late artist built his shrine-like grottos deep into the structure and then encased them in the geometric constructed shell, these personal accumulations now rendered invisible to all but the memory of the creator. This decision clearly related to the impending threat and scrutiny of National Socialism on artists at the time, but it also is an important aesthetic gesture. As if turned inside out, Misa's chambers in the Berlin Biennial, in contrast, present every surface, every object, every image. The two artists share an interest in merging larger issues of their times with personal references, even as Schwitter's ultimately conceals what Misa reveals. After exhibitions like the Berlin Biennial, Misa completed a number of projects similar to this installation at the Frankfurter Kunstverein in 1999. Drained of the visual barrage of colorful pop icons, the installation Erzreligion Blut Lazarett. I should note that Misa likes to create his own words based on kind of working with the German idea of being able to kind of slap words together to create a larger compound word. So this basically means arch religion or overall religion, blood Lazareth. The installation Erzreligion Blut Lazarett presents a wholly different set of concerns within a space that trades the chaotic teenager's room for what feels like a stage set for a drama about German history. An unoccupied table with ritualistic candles and bread sits in the center, while in an arrangement of objects to the left, a white-caped, cross-bearing figure appears to lead a motley assembly of military troops, which are represented by fabrics and helmets, which you can see here on the left. Text predominates here, operating more like announcements and propaganda than simply the descriptive or indexical signifiers as in the earlier installations. Real and slightly modified terms like Blutzoll, blood tax, Waffen, weapons, Allvater, universal father, and Richard Wagner, which means sort of total Richard Wagner, relate to loaded symbols of Nazi teaching. Indeed, the imagery, text, and even colors of the installation, black, white, and red were the official colors of National Socialism, relate to this Nazi past. While this installation appears to signal a drastic shift in Meese's work, it is actually drawing from concerns present in the previous installations. If Meese already explored taboo subjects relating to sexuality and culture, here he takes on his own country's messy past, a subject now common in post-war German art. In the immediate aftermath of World War II and Germany's reconstruction, German culture overall was in question. When so much of the country's art, music, and mythology had been soiled by National Socialism, artists faced the dilemma famously described by Hannah Arendt as, quote, to make poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. While Meese belongs to a later generation of artists, he and many of his contemporaries nonetheless deal with this dilemma indirectly. In this project, Meese sets forth several of the aesthetic strategies of his post-war predecessors, such as the Vienna Actionists, Neo-Expressionists, Joseph Beuys, and Anselm Kiefer, incorporating them into a powerful amalgam and creating something entirely new. I should also note that Meese's works of this immediate period do have a weighty seriousness that is fairly short-lived in his career. In essence, he will ultimately begin to take the adolescent obsessions from the earlier installations that we saw and sort of reincorporate them along with a lot of these heavier subjects. I think this is something you can definitely see in the present installation here as well. Coming back to this particular installation. First, it's important to point out a central overall strategy in Meese's work, which has deeply embedded roots in German history and culture. The idea of the total work of art, or Gesamtkunstwerk. And again, this idea of total is a term that Meese uses very often, again, in performances, and will use the total as an English term. This term, Gesamtkunstwerk, first used by 19th century German opera composer Richard Wagner, whose name appears on the wall here, proposed the revitalization of an art form based in ancient Greek tragedy, which would ultimately bring together music, theater, and the visual arts. Meese was already exploring this concept in his Berlin Biennial installation, and here he took it further by substituting the audio track and film footage with an actual performance within the space. The concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, like so many other aspects of German culture, was itself destabilized through its incorporation in Nazi propaganda spectacles and also through nationalism's own appropriation of Wagner as a cultural hero. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the things that I think is really fascinating about Meese's work is his interest in Parsifal. And Parsifal happens to be the Wagner opera that the National Socialists took as this kind of the perfect Gesamtkunstwerk. The Gesamtkunstwerk was taken up after the war most dramatically by Vienna actionists like Hermann Nietzsche and Rudolf Schwarzkogler in the 1960s, who revealed the underbelly of this total or totalizing work of art. Their transgressive, ritualistic performances, often filled with naked bodies, violence, and destruction, made direct reference to religious rites and Wagnerian opera. The vestiges of ritual and violence in this installation, for example, relate to this type of rereading of the Gesamtkunstwerk, although Meese's performances and installations never quite delve into the abject to the same degree as the Vienna actionists had. Several post-war German artists also took on loaded cultural and political symbols as subject matter, seeking ways of addressing these taboo subjects or even reinscribing them. Meese's work often draws from these same subjects, referring to a common past and also sometimes to post-war art itself. His rampant use of crosses in this installation, for example, calls to mind ancient symbols of Christianity and the Nazi swastika itself, as well as the Vienna Actionist performance and the Braunkreuz and Rotkreuz materials of Joseph Beuys. That's the Brown Cross, which was Beuys's, it's his own designated cross that has its own meaning for him, and the Rotkreuz, which is a cross that he uses to mean salvation and healing. Misa shares with Beuys also an interest in self-mythologizing and in the performative, a loose notion of the artist, or art itself, as a form of redemption for all. For Beuys, this was a spiritual thing, and his teaching and preaching about social sculpture became his lifelong pursuit. For Misa, this seems to be quite a bit later, more typical of this generation after the post-war generation, starting with German history and culture, and then injecting it with a good deal of pop humor. So here we have two images of Misa in this sort of self-mythologizing and preaching mode. On the right is an image, a still from the performance that we looked at in the very beginning at Bortolami Gallery in New York this spring, where I'll show a little clip of it later, but he's standing below the word Graal, which means grail, and you can see to the right the dictatorship of art. He's basically preaching to the gallery goers in New York about how art can ultimately be their salvation. And then this painting, and there are a number of these paintings by Misa from the mid to late 90s, which basically show him as this sort of Christ figure almost, with halo here, and often in this also very German mode, this very German portrait mode that calls Dürer, whose famous self-portraits are kind of the self-portrait emblem in Germany. Misa's appropriation of the Sieg-Heil Nazi salute, which we saw at the start of this talk, is a hefty symbol to tackle, but has a reference point in Anselm Kiefer's notorious Occupations series from 1969. In Kiefer's photographic series, shown here in the center and left images, the artist took photographs of himself posing in salute in various cities around Europe, with captions such as, "On X date, I occupied the city of X." Kiefer's series was extremely controversial when it was first published in 1975. So he did the series in 1969, it was published in 75, and that's still 30 years after the end of World War II, and it was still a very, very sensitive topic. It was published in the art and in the art journal too, Interfunktionen. Clearly, the historical and emotional distance was still not quite long enough for many of its viewers. Yet the series originally sought to neutralize this type of power gesture through a set of ridiculous poses, the artist standing atop major monuments or attempting to walk on water in a bathtub. Another loaded symbol that Misa takes on is Nazi military dress, seen here in the helmets and jackets. Markus Lüpertz and George Baselitz, two neo-expressionist painters, also took on these symbols as subjects. Lüpertz's painting on the top, Lüpertz repeatedly invoked the helmet itself as a stand-in for this idea of a Nazi power emblem. And Baselitz more subtly referred to the short pants dress of the Hitler Youth in several of his works, but particularly in his iconic painting, Big Night Down the Drain from 1962-63 at the bottom. And you also have, of course, this sort of masturbatory gesture, and just the idea of kind of showing the phallus is also something that was this taboo gesture, which we'll see over and over in Misa's work as well. More than 30 years later, Misa's use of these symbols holds all of these references, making them even deeper reflections on 20th century German history. At the same time, Misa's incorporation of contemporary pop symbols asks us whether culture in general hasn't reassigned its myths to new and different figures. And so at this point, after exploring several of the critical aspects and themes and motifs of Misa's work, I'd like to turn to the present installation here at Mead, and beginning with the centerpiece, which is the Mutter Parsifal sculpture. You can see in the scale in this piece, it definitely functions as a monument. The materials involved here are, it's styrofoam, so you have this, what you would think of when you think of a monument to something. It's usually something that's marble or bronze or something sort of heroic. And here we have something that's actually ultimately totally lightweight and transportable, and for Misa functions functions as a prop for his performances. We have also, in addition to that, this sort of rough surface, which is another idea of this kind of lack of refinement. Again, something that we wouldn't be expecting to see in a sort of in a monument, in a monumental sculpture. And the color as well, I think, is interesting in thinking about other German contemporaries of Misa, and particularly Dieter Roth, who did a number of sculptures with chocolate. And these chocolate sculptures were often carved in a way that ultimately the surface is very similar to this. And the idea with these chocolate sculptures was that they would slowly, I mean, it's an organic material, so they would slowly sort of rot over time, change color. And he made all these drawings. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of this amazing set of drawings he has, but the idea is that the form starts in a certain way, and then over time, he's charted out how it will change based on the sort of decomposition of the materials. And there's something about a lot of Misa's sculptures that remind me of that. This sort of, it works that almost looks as if they're in the act of decomposing, even if they're not the same organic materials that Roth was using. And now, very importantly, thinking about this Parsifal idea, which I mentioned before with Wagner. The story of Parsifal, it's sort of an Arthurian legend and another quest for the Holy Grail type of story. This, as I mentioned before, is something that the National Socialist Party was really fascinated by. They were particularly fascinated by Wagner's treatment of the figure Parsifal in this opera. It was also Wagner's last opera, so it takes on a sort of pathos in his career. They greatly admired this particular treatment of Parsifal because Wagner really brings him out as being sort of a hero of divine origin and as someone who can redeem humankind. So by taking that on, Misa is not simply taking on the idea of Wagner as being the father of the Gesamtkunstwerk and that sort of idea, but he's also taking on all of that past. And he is not the first to have done this. This is actually a theme that a number of other German artists have tackled in the post-war period. First of all, Joseph Beuys actually famously had always wanted to do his own opera design his own opera of Parsifal, and ultimately never was able to. This is actually also an image from a performance of Misa's relating to Parsifal, which was entitled Jonathan Meese ist Mutter Parsifal, is Mother Parsifal. This series of charcoal, and it's pretty much charcoal and blood on paper, on canvas. It's a series by Anselm Kiefer. It's called his Parsifal Cycle. And it's actually composed of 4 paintings. All of these 3 are the ones that are mostly seen together. And I think it's interesting that Misa takes up this idea of Parsifal as much as he does, and the fact that his post-war German contemporaries had also done this. For Kiefer, he basically looks at this very, very directly as part of the National Socialist past. Although it's hard to see in these pages, these are actually enormous works, and so when they're small, all the text on them is really impossible to see. But the cycle tells the story of Parsifal. The first work with the crib designating the young Parsifal, the birth of Parsifal. And there's part of this where Parsifal apparently had a very sheltered childhood. His mother sheltered him very much. So again, remember that Misa's work is called Mutter Parsifal. So we have the childhood represented here, and then basically Parsifal recognizing his power and recognizing that things were not so, once he was out of this sort of sheltered universe, recognizing that the world is not as perfect as it is. We have on the right-hand canvas, the second one, a sword and some blood, showing this kind of violence that will be in his future. And finally, in the last, or the third in the cycle, this bottom canvas, there's actually part of the text on that canvas includes the names of several of the German terrorists who were part of the Red Army faction, which would have been a contemporary subject from the 70s and 80s that Kiefer has then inserted into this canvas. So he's bringing in, again, contemporary political events and past political history, kind of compressing all of these into his images. So again, and so now Misa has said of Mutter Parsifal when asked about it that Parsifal was his own mother, which is kind of an interesting way of talking about it because there is definitely a mother in the story. Misa also has this, famously in his biography, he's very, very close with his mother, as many of you maybe have seen in performances or have seen in photographs of him. He's often photographed or he performs with his mother now. He apparently lives with her still. He had a very sheltered childhood. So all of these things are interesting, and I mean, not to get into a deeply, deeply biographical reading of this, but I think that he's certainly setting that out there. None of these aspects of his biography are private in any way. And so he's presenting himself as Parsifal, ultimately. And Parsifal, known as sort of the one who can redeem humankind, and also as sort of the clever fool, which is something that description makes sense, I think, in a lot of ways when you see Misa's performances. So I wanted to also talk about this idea of the primitive in Misa's work as well, which is something that I think relates to 20th century German art and relates to a certain part of his process that I think is important to see as part of a larger context. But the work on the left, the Count of Monte Cristo, is a bronze, and as I was mentioning with the form of the Mutter Parsifal, this idea of this kind of this large styrofoam piece, this is also something that, although it's cast in bronze in a more traditional sculpting mode, the way that he actually makes these works is pretty untraditional. And this is where I wanted to show a short clip from a video, which I think really helps in understanding the sculpture and what it looks like. And so this is Misa here, and this is him now working on this sculpture of two men. It's basically of an execution. So you see he starts with this sort of wire armature, and then there's no refining at all of the clay when he's wrapping it around the figure. This will ultimately be what is cast in bronze. He's basically working from a block of clay, pulling off a sheet of it, and then wrapping it, and kind of pounding it around, using his fingers. It's very childlike. There's something that is important here when we think about, as I was saying, the legacy of 20th century German art. Even in the earlier part of the 20th century, German expressionists, someone like Emil Nolde or Paul Klee, were really trying to reach for this idea of the primitive, of the untrained, of this sort of rough-hewn, where they could access that idea of the work of the child. And there are actually books published on that they were reading about child drawings. And Misa definitely has that aspect in his work as well. And then again, as I was talking about his relationship with Anselm Kiefer and with Joseph Beuys, who were this post-war generation who kind of extracted the earlier concepts, this is also related to someone like Georg Baselitz, who was doing similar types of these rough-hewn sculptures as a neo-expressionist in the 1970s. Looking back at this, you can really see how that's just kind of a sheet of clay that he's just wrapped around it, and how the kind of hood is formed the same thing, and the tie is the same way as well. The paintings that are in the installation here, which I won't talk about in great detail with the slides, because as I was just realizing when over there, you really need to see them in person. The textures alone are just not going to be represented here, but just to give you some sense of some of the things that we'd already seen in the earlier work that now you can sort of see through his later work. First of all, this idea of the self-portrait. So we have Misa here inserting himself into this piece is called the Sphinx, the parentheses Dr. Rippchen, which basically means pork cutlet, which is a very southern German dish. So he's again inserting himself into the idea of the Sphinx, this kind of all-knowing being, and this deeply mythological sort of figure, ancient symbol, bringing in the idea of contemporary Germany in sort of a comedic way with the idea of the pork cutlet. And then, yes, using his face here, incorporating text, and again, another photograph of himself on the top with sort of a red mark, kind of a cross-like mark on it. In this canvas, some of those same ideas we see along the sides and along the whole bottom, a number of these self-portraits of the artist, which he's inserted in here, sort of collaged in. And then we have, along with this sort of very expressive painting, which is similar to what I was kind of talking about briefly with sculpture, with expressionism and neo-expressionism, we have these insertions that relate to popular culture from the 70s, 80s, and up to today, I guess. Even the No in the center is most likely referring to Dr. No, which is a film that he references often. And on the far left, when he was doing a number of his own self-portraits, which I had showed one of before, he also became interested in a lot of other artists who had famously done self-portraits, Dürer being one of them, as I mentioned, and particularly Francis Bacon. And this is his, basically, to me at least, it's his recreation of a sort of Francis Bacon-style self-portrait, which is similarly expressive in gesture. Bacon's portraits always seem like they have this really strong, they're very powerful portraits where you are getting there's a lot of the psychology of the artist behind the gestures. So it makes a lot of sense. This is something that he would be interested in here. You also see the phalluses all throughout the canvas here, and some other sort of more primitive-looking faces and drawings within here that in some cases almost recall someone like Basquiat. So what I also wanted to show, this particular video of him sort of performing these paintings in his studio, the incorporation of the music. He's listening to this classic German kid song called The Fairy Prince, the Märchen Prince. So now, if you think about the types of paintings that you'll see in the gallery here, you now are seeing kind of how a lot of those are made. And that's not to say he's always dancing around and performing them like this, but he does this on many occasions. A number of his paintings are done through performance. The other thing that I was going to note a bit, the idea of other contemporary artists who are doing some similar work, where the performance then informs the objects that are created, or the objects inform the performance. While the type of work that Misa is doing is definitely, I mean, for me, it's utterly distinct from anything that anyone else is doing. There are some connections. He's not sort of, there are the other ideas that are floating around in the contemporary art world now that are very much related. And one of those is an artist who I had the opportunity to work with for the Whitney Biennial last year, and that's Matt Mulliken. And this is a superimposition that I've just put here of Matt Mulliken in one of his hypnosis performances. So this is something that Mulliken has been doing since the 70s, and he's actually a real fan of Misa, which I've recently found out. For Mulliken, unlike Misa, who just goes into the performances and just acts in however way he's going to act, Mulliken actually works with a hypnotist who hypnotizes him before the performance, and then he will have a performance like we see here, where he doesn't know what's going to happen. No one in the audience knows what's going to happen. He's just sort of acting out. So in some cases, they can be incredibly boring. He might just kind of crawl around on the floor for a really long time. In other cases, he gets really manic. This is probably an example of that here. But it's pretty interesting. It's kind of tapping into something that we all, I guess, are interested in, seeing these people in these totally unself-conscious, or in some cases unconscious modes of behaving. And for Mulliken, as related to these painting performances of Misa, Mulliken will often, you can see behind him in the performance image, this large sheet of paper, or several sheets of paper. And while under hypnosis and while performing, he will draw. And you never also know what he's going to draw, but that's always something that comes out in these performances. What you end up with are a lot of these larger installations that he then later makes from a number of works that he made while under hypnosis, and he'll combine those with other drawings he does non-under hypnosis. And in any case, so it's just that similar type of mode, kind of working back and forth, where performance and object or installation are actually very tightly wound together. Thinking about someone like Paul Klee, or other German expressionists who were attempting to really utilize that, some sort of childlike mode, or to be able to produce from that place, and never really being able to. Always having that conscious artist side, always having that composition. And I think that's true of the neo-expressionists, who were also doing the same idea. So I think that it's this sort of attempt at finding that mode, but with also the knowledge that you're not going to actually be able to tap into that, and not really even wanting to completely. I mean, I think that was something that really hit me in looking at even those very early installations of Misa's, where you can dissect these things. I mean, you really can. Like, there's a lot of nonsense words, but the more that you start breaking them apart, they all make sense. In terms of women artists, Rebecca Horn is a really important performance artist who came out of Germany in the post-war period. Contemporaries of his, though, who were doing things in the same way, with a sort of manic style of performance, that sort of messiness, for lack of a better term. She doesn't fit that category at all. There is something very, seemingly very sort of masculine about what he's doing, or how he's presenting it, I guess I should say. Misa has also designed stage sets and has also acted in several performances, several in the Volksbühne in Hamburg, and most famously in the State Opera House in Berlin, where he performed his Jonathan Meese is Mutter Parsifal. And that was this kind of amazing opportunity for him where Parsifal was being restaged, and they'd set it up so that Misa's own installation and performance of Parsifal would be sort of across the street, and so people could come back and forth and see Misa's version of Parsifal at the same time. And in Misa's Parsifal, you had video showing parts of the actual performance and parts of the audience, of his audience. So, I mean, I think it's all really wrapped up together. I mean, I think if you think about Misa's own fascination with someone like Wagner and this idea of this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk and that taking kind of on his whole life, the Frankfurt installation, which feels very much like a stage set, can very much operate like one. They're all completely intertwined. Thank you very much.